Miközben Magyarország a 2026-os választásokra készül, a világ körülöttünk újra rajzolja önmagát. Új hatalmak emelkednek fel, régiek omlanak össze. A politika, a gazdaság és a technológia versenye új korszakot nyit. Ezek a változások nem csak az eljövendő kormány mozgásterét határozzák meg, hanem a mi mindennapi életünket is, hogy mennyit keresünk, hol dolgozunk, mit vásárolunk. Én Szilárd vagyok, és Unorthodox címmel egy interjúsorozatot indítok útjára, amelyben a világ legkülönbözőbb tájairól fogok beszélgetni olyan emberekkel, akik segítenek megérteni, miben is vagyunk, és mi jön ezután. Lesznek jobb- és baloldaliak, konzervatívok és liberálisok, európaiak, észak- és dél-amerikaiak, ázsiaiak és afrikaiak. Ami közös bennük, hogy mernek másképp gondolkodni, és túllátnak a régi sémákon. Unorthodox. Új nézőpont a világra. Sok magyar ember számára Németország méltán követendő példa az anyagi jólét, a gazdasági hatékonyság és a politikai szabadság bástyája. Egyre gyakrabban hallani viszont olyan hangokat is, amelyek romló gazdaságra, romló közszolgáltatásokra, rossz minőségű infrastruktúrára és társadalmi dezintegrációra hívják fel a figyelmet. Az Európai Unió legnagyobb gazdaságaként, Magyarország legnagyobb kereskedelmi partnereként Németországnak aránytalanul nagy hatása van hétköznapi életünkre, így egyáltalán nem mindegy, hogy hogyan is mennek ott a dolgok. Sziasztok, én Szilárd vagyok, és ma egy olyan vendéggel fogok beszélgetni, aki nagyon közelről tanulmányozza a német gazdasági csoda kifulladását és a nyomában fellángoló útkeresést. Ő Wolfgang Münchau gazdasági újságíró, a Euro Intelligence elemző intézet igazgatója, akinek tavaly megjelent kötete és heti elemzései is rengeteg érdekes szempontot adnak a német és az uniós folyamatok megértéséhez. Az interjút angol nyelven készítettem, amelyhez magyar feliratot társítottunk. Ha viszont magyar nyelvű szinkronnal szeretnétek meghallgatni, akkor lent a videó beállításaiban ki tudjátok választani a magyar hangsávot is. Mielőtt bemutatnám a vendégem, még arra szeretnélek kérni, hogy mindenképpen iratkozzatok fel a csatornára, ha még nem tettétek volna meg, és támogassátok a Partizán munkáját, hogy minél többféle további műsort tudjunk készíteni nektek. Mindenről, minden infót megtaláltok a leírásban. Wolfgang Münchau, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. Welcome to Partizán.
Gila, thank you very much for having me.
I would like to talk a bit about Germany, the German economic model. For us in Hungary, it's very important questions because of the very strong integration into the German economy of the Hungarian economy. So in this respect, I found your book, Kaput, The End of the German Miracle, a very enlightening read. And I would like to talk a bit about that. And afterwards, a bit more about the European Union in general and the future of the European Union in general. By November of this year, Germany has actually accumulated 14 consecutive quarters, so around 3.5 years of economic stagnation or outright economic recession. And these 3.5 years actually coincides with the 3.5 years of the war in Ukraine. So it would be very easy to argue, and in fact many do argue in Europe and in Germany, that the blame for the economic hardships of Germany are to be put on the shoulders of the war in Ukraine. In your book, you claim that the hardships or the decline of the German economic model actually started much earlier than February 2022. So if we were to stick to this chronological perspective, where would you identify, in what moment would you identify the inflection point?
You know, they say correlation is not causation, and you know, we're making it ourselves too easy to say, okay, German, you know, the GDP numbers are negative. This is the same period as the war. There is obviously a relationship, But this is not the interesting story. The interesting story is that that happened a long time before. And I think if you talk about these inflection points, I think I see 2 points really. The first point is at around 2018, when German industrial production peaked, and German industrial production has sort of fallen since 2018 pretty steadily. That for me is the point where the decline of the German economy is visible in the data. If you take the industrial production and also private investment, which is also a metric of the underlying health of the economy. If you take those data, they've been in steady decline. It's almost a straight line if you go from there to today. So we're looking at 6 to 8 years, depending on whether you look at private investment or at industrial production. You'll be looking at 6 years of decline. But there is a previous inflection point, and this is basically the moment when Germany decided to miss the digital revolution. A lot of what happens today is about Germany not investing in modern technology, Germany specializing on mid-tech, what's called mid-tech. It's an unfair expression because, the diesel engine is not easy. It's not, I wouldn't know how to build it. It's not mid-tech, it's high-tech. But by mid-tech, I mean non-digital, the analog, the mechanical world. And Germany specialized on the non-digital world, and it used digital technologies to integrate it. So a German luxury car would have a lot of digital systems inside of it. But the systems would not be made in Germany. They would be made elsewhere, and certainly they were certainly not invented in Germany. But the German specialization was both the machine itself and the integration of the machine. And what Germany didn't see is that the digital technologies started to encroach on the analog world. And I say analog, this is not entirely the correct expression if you are detailed, because a mechanical device. I'm talking about mechanics, chemistry. I'm talking about the non-digital tech world. And Germany specialized on that. And what happened with digitalization is that digital technologies encroached on the analog world. You see this on our mobile phones. Our mobile phones is a telephone. They are a weather forecasting station. They are a computer. They do email, and they do so many other things. They're a camera. They're a compass. So these were all digital at one point, all analog devices that people had. Maybe not all of them, but people had several devices that now are basically a fully digital product with no moving parts. And that's happening to more and more product. It happens to cars. This is the latest, of the old technology products that are basically becoming digitalized, and digitalized not so much in terms that a car will still have an engine and still have wheels and stuff that moves, but the value added of the car. And this is where what it is about. It is about the money. The value added of the car will be increasingly software. And software is a purely digital product, or a product that is not origined in engineering, and that's not a strength of Germany. So Germany missed the digital revolution, and it missed it for reasons of arrogance, the belief that the old things are superior. It wasn't made at home. The digital revolution had its origins in the United States. So it specialized on what it knew it was good at, rather than trying to enter the new world, both in the private and the public sector. The German government itself has been notoriously underinvested in digital technologies. You see this until recently. They were still having a lot of fax machines. It was only about last year that the Bundesbank, the German central bank, switched off its fax machines. And the military has been using it. Doctors' offices have been using it until very recently, and I think some of them may still use it. Unheard of in the rest of Europe. We wouldn't know how to communicate with them because we don't have them anymore outside of Germany. But that's very typical of what happened. Now, the current German government is trying to fix this or trying to address this. But German industry is still pretty much in this sort of analog world. Now there are many reasons why this happened, and Germany had, largely through your own country, Hungary, and other countries from Central and Eastern Europe, the German old tech. This crisis would have happened 20 years ago had it not been for enlargement of the EU. Because enlargement of the EU gave Germany it prolonged a model that was already getting out of date in the 1990s. It gave it a new lease of life because it allowed the supply chains to become much more efficient. Germany had basically cheap labor, which it could never have at home. That was certainly the beginning of European enlargement was the wage level in Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, Czech Republic were significantly lower than they are today, and Germany benefited from that. Another thing Germany benefited from, or two other things. One was the fact that China was complementary, not a competitor. So China in those years bought all the German gear. And it produced other things. China produced consumer products. Germany didn't produce consumer products so much as China did. So they were complementary in what they were after. And the third thing that benefited Germany was the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis about 10 years ago, when the euro fell, and that made the euro fell without generating inflation, and that made the German economy uber competitive for a period. It is basically a number of things that came together that kept a model that was really starting to become, out of date, like 25 years ago. It gave it a longer period of time. And then you see the decline for 8 years. The 3.5 years that you mentioned, that coincided with the war in Ukraine, this is only the recession. Now, recessions are falls in economic growth, and they're usually cyclical phenomena. And what happens when you have a structural decline, and Germany has been structurally declining, the potential growth rate is about 0.5%. So if you have a cyclical fluctuation around a line that's at 0.5%, a long recession is a very normal phenomenon for the period that you are below the cycle or below your structural trend growth, and that's what you saw. So it's nothing like that just suddenly happened. It's a very normal situation that a country that's weak will be for a certain period below zero. And for a certain period, Germany will be at around 1% growth. And I think that will probably happen in the next few years, that German growth will be around 1%. And the average is about 0.5%. And I think that's what I look at. I look at the average growth, at the long-term sustainable growth, which I put at about 0.5, 0.6%. That would be my best estimate of where it is today. And that's an extremely weak performance.
Especially if you consider that other parts of the world are growing faster, then it means that even if you have growth, you actually lose your relative position to others in a sense. You opened so many interesting avenues that I want to talk about, but a bit staying with this technological miscalculation that you talked about. After the fall of the Soviet-inspired regimes in Central and Eastern Europe, these countries have been bombarded by this ideology that state intervention in the market is bad, that the success depends on the state not intervening, and also that this kind of corrupt intertwining between political elites and business elites is bad for business, bad for the economy. And reading your book, it seems to me that Germany actually did not heed this later advice, especially. So you talk about this corporatist model where the political elites are intertwined with the older business elites that are interested in keeping up the old industrial model and not innovating. Can you give me a more detailed description of how this intertwining works and how it actually blocks innovation in a sense?
Yes, no, absolutely. This is, I think, the key issue indeed. Now, after the fall of communism, virtually all of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe, they leapfrogged that continental, that German social democratic model, that corporatist model. You went straight into virtually all of the countries went straight into a capitalist model. a more sort of pure capitalist model. The German model was not considered to be actually a model for Central and Eastern Europe. But Germany itself didn't change. Germany itself still today has a corporatist model. Now, when Olaf Scholz, the previous German chancellor, discovered, or was told that he had a recession, the first thing he did was to call in the car industry, the steel industry, and the chemical industry into his office and try to fix this. And that's the way they used to do this. And there's another important player in this, or two important players. One are the trade unions. They would normally sit in the room if the issue is labor, anything to do with wages. That was what they did in 2003 when Gerhard Schröder was the chancellor. So they basically agreed all sorts of labor changes, labor regulations, and wage moderation, and suddenly everything would work. And in those days it did, one has to say. Another player in this game is the banks. And I think that they're critical to understand how the system works. Now, in Germany, it's not just companies, free markets operating. It is a free market, but the big companies are deeply political. They are funded by banks. The banks are partially state-owned. Politicians sit on the board of the banks, and they decide what the banks do, where the banks lend money. There's a state-owned German bank called the Bank for Reconstruction and Development. The German, it has a different name these days, but it's basically a state development bank. So often you would get a loan by the state development bank that would be supercharged by a loan of a private bank, where a politician would sit on the board of this bank and give the money to an industrial company, and the same politician or a friendly politician would sit on the board of that company. They would all basically do this together. And what this basically means is that if German industry gets something, gets a mega trend wrong, and the car industry got the electric car completely wrong. They invested too late. They didn't see it coming. They underestimated the technology. They overestimated their ability to adjust to this. So that was a mega mistake. When these mega mistakes happen in a corporatist system, everybody makes the mistake. It's a bit like communism. If they get it wrong, everything gets it wrong. And if they get it right, everyone gets it right. So there is a bit of this sort of binary outcome situation. And this is what happened to the German car industry, for example. They all got it wrong. The whole of Germany got Russia wrong. There was virtually no voice in Germany, that criticized the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, because they were all agreed that they needed the gas.
But
all the companies were basically...
Sorry to interrupt, but I have a clarification to ask you here, because at the moment when West Germany opened up, so to speak, to energy cooperation to the Soviet Union, so in the 50s, 60s, and mostly in the 70s. It was in the moment when actually neither the US, neither the UK could actually guarantee for its European allies safe and secure ways to get fossil fuel energy. So in a sense, it made sense to start doing business with Russia. And if I read your book correctly, you are also sympathetic to this kind of policy, this Ostpolitik of Willy Brandt or Helmut Schmidt. I wanted to ask, where did this kind of like sensible, realistic politics turn into this orthodoxy that you are talking about, that nobody questioned Nord Stream 2, and where did it go wrong?
The relationship with the Soviet Union obviously dated back a long time ago, and sort of the gas diplomacy started in the period of Willy Brandt. Obviously not on the scale. Germany or even the old West Germany was a highly developed country, but it didn't have. It was dependent on external resources, certainly dependent on oil. It had coal, and that was a big energy provider, and it had nuclear. And the modern politics, and this is where it changed. After Helmut Kohl left office, the Social Democrats went into government with the Greens. And the Greens insisted on a phasing out of coal and nuclear over a period of time. Nuclear was most important to the Greens. So that sort of hypercharged the German need for gas beyond of what they had before. Because previously, nuclear was, by the time the Scholz government came into office, they still had 6 nuclear power stations. Now, that's not a lot, but they were still providing 14% of the electricity. By the time, in the early part of the 20th century, I don't have the numbers, but it must have been approximately 20-25%, maybe 30% in that sort of ballpark. That was the proportion of nuclear energy, and most of the rest was coal. So they had to replace a lot of energy supply that was practically domestic. I mean, obviously for nuclear you have to import uranium, but for all the, it was pretty much a source of energy, also in which Germany developed a lot of sophistication. Germany had a lot of nuclear physicists, nuclear chemists, engineers in this area. So Germany was really sort of one of the top countries in the world in for construction and engineering of nuclear power stations. So this was something, and politically that no longer became acceptable. And that's when the cheap Russian gas came in. Schröder himself basically saw this. I mean, after he left politics in 2005, as you know, he immediately joined the board of Gazprom, because he saw that was probably the most profitable business you can imagine in Germany, because Germany badly needed the gas, and he was the guy who would give it to them. And that was done through the pipelines. They built Nord Stream 1 in the first decade of the century, then they built Nord Stream 2 in the second decade. And it was basically Germany. This was dictated. This wasn't like, this wasn't like dictated by Germany playing some geopolitical gambit. It's not like they trusted Putin. It is that they just needed the gas, because they had put themselves in a situation where they had no alternatives. Mm. And the relationship with Russia at the time seemed sufficiently uncontroversial. The Germans always, there is always a separation going on in the heads of most German politicians between human rights and business. They never thought Putin would invade Ukraine. That was not something that they had considered. And even when he did, there were many Germans who thought this is something that their trading relationship, their commercial relationship with Russia could survive this. That obviously became clear very soon afterwards that this was not possible. It was one of these many, many misjudgments. Mm. So it was a string of events that carried this, and German politicians were mostly complacent. I mean, one of them was Angela Merkel, who was sort of governing Germany in that period. She was not the instigator of this, and she was also not the most pro-Russian politician. She was actually quite skeptical about Putin, but she kind of let it go, because she also realized she needed this relationship. And in any case, she was in a coalition with the Social Democrats. That was the party of Gerhard Schröder. And the Social Democrats were the party that linked Germany with Russia, because that was the distinguishing characteristic of the SPD, that it had the connections with Moscow. It was part of this, and there was this group. I always compared it. There was the Eastern Committee of the German economy. Lots of companies, basically, they were in this. That this was a sort of a lobbying group that tried to open up business with Russia, including armament business, and they would go to the St. Petersburg Forum. That was like a Davos-style junket, a Russian version of a Davos-style junket. Putin would always be there. Schröder would always be there. They would all be together. The entire sort of German-Russian, friendship, commercial friendship society would meet there every year, and it became a sort of a very big thing. And while East Europe, and then I remember Poland, the Baltic republics complained bitterly about Nord Stream 2. And the United States started to get on this, and the U.S. Senate passed legislation to stop Germany from doing that. And all of this notwithstanding, Germany defied all of this. Germany said, well, we need the stuff, so who are they? And they played tricks. They played, all sorts of tricks to circumvent the American, sanctions. And in the end, it was Putin's invasion that ended it. Mm. It would not have ended otherwise. There was simply the interests that were behind it were too big. But it also goes to show that Germans, certainly German businesses, but also many German politicians have a very insufficient understanding of geopolitics, to put this very mildly. They didn't see this coming. Putin's invasion of Ukraine wasn't just an act that started in 2022. It started in 2014. Putin's behavior how he dealt with, domestic opposition, how he dealt with, other countries' sovereignty has been in evidence since he invaded Georgia. So we have been sort of clear about, there was certainly knowledge about who he was and what he would do. And yet that did not stop anyone in Germany from investing in this relationship. And then they did the same with China. They created dependency with China. Now, China is a very different case from Russia. China is not invading other countries, but China is certainly a country that has developed competitiveness against Germany in a way that the Germans also didn't see, because they saw China being a complementary partner, and suddenly China grew a car industry that was bigger than Germany's, and and they also grew a solar panel industry, which the Germans originally developed. They were the original leaders, and then China bought it up and basically, never looked back. So we have a lot of these things happening as sort of as a result of geopolitical incompetence, and this is closely linked to that corporatist system where everybody sort of tried to find a national consensus. And interestingly, the media, journalists like you and me, they were part of this consensus. There wasn't anyone who would speak out. The only people I did, but I didn't live in Germany at the time. I still do. I still live in the UK. It was easy to see when you were abroad than when you were in Germany.
In a sense, if we look at the trajectory of China, we see that state intervention can be very successful as well if you make smart decisions. So here are you claiming that state intervention in all the cases is a problematic because it mostly leads to bad decisions, or that here in this particular case, in all the technological and geopolitical cases, the German elites made bad decisions?
The old joke from the movie The Big Short, when the main character walked into a meeting of betting anonymous, and he announced to the crowd that the problem with betting is not betting, is losing, and it's very similar to here. I mean, picking winners, as people sort of decry this option. If you pick losers, it's a bad thing. If you do pick winners, you actually done well. The Chinese didn't pick winners as companies. So China didn't go in and say, okay, I'm picking Huawei and I'm picking this company. China picked sectors. China said, okay, we know the sectors: batteries, rare earths, minerals, the technology that turns them into magnets and other sort of downstream products. Solar power and other sort of renewable energies. There are a number of these things that China specialized in and prioritized. And the Chinese government then threw money basically at it and allowed companies to have access to this money. But it did not intervene anymore. It basically generated competition. That's very different from what Germany did. Germany never specialized on sectors. Germany basically said, we have what we have and we protect what we have. That's a very different one, and we work together with them. This is not state intervention. So this is what we're seeing in Germany is very much corporatism. This is not what's happening in China. So I think one has to distinguish between Chinese, trying to pick sectors, which is an industrial policy, and German corporatism, which is trying to push money, subsidies towards sectors that we think are, that employ a lot of people at the moment, at the expense of investing into new sectors. And this is the victims in Germany is new investment. There are no new companies because the old companies get all the money. That's basically the downside of corporatism. That's why nothing grows, because taxes are high. And all the money goes, the joke is all the money always goes to Volkswagen. And if it doesn't get invented by Volkswagen, it doesn't get invented in Germany. It's unfortunately that bad.
It seems that since the beginning of this year, Germany and also the EU, but now let's just stay with Germany, is actually betting on a sector, and that is defense. So it was taken out of it was exempted from the debt brake, defense investment. The shares of many of these German defense companies are skyrocketing. I'm also seeing this, like every other company is trying to somehow rebrand themselves as a defense company. So I've read an article in Spiegel about a Hamburg-based food technology startup that is now rebranding of selling robot kitchens to the army. So everybody wants to get into this defense craze. And I'm wondering, what's your take on this? Because on one hand, this is also can be just the doubling down on this old industrial model of producing steel and producing cars and these kind of things, just that it's even less materially advantageous because you don't need new tanks or new rockets every other year as you need new cars and new, phones every other day. So what's your take on this whole defense investment?
I see it exactly like you do. This is part of the old system. It's not, Germany could say, look, we need, what do we need? First of all, let's start what we need. We want to defend ourselves better. We need to spend more money, so we need satellite-based systems. We need drones. We need robots. We need completely new technologies. How do we develop these technologies? Maybe we need to import something. Maybe we develop some of our own. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is that they're recruiting more people. So most of it is an investment. Most of it is buying land, recruiting soldiers, because they need to up the size of the army. The second thing is they're buying tanks and ammunition because that's what Rheinmetall produces, and it's another sort of it's a subsidy program for Rheinmetall. And now you mentioned there are some companies in Germany. I don't want to dismiss this completely. In the sort of modern era, there are Germany has some high-tech defense companies, also defense companies that use AI, but nothing of the scale that Germany needs. So the right strategy would be to actually completely overturn this, and the current strategy, and saying we need an intelligent high-tech strategy. And that's just not happening. It may still happen. There is a lot of pressure. There was a big article by the head of the Kiel Institute for World Economics. It's the institute that does the Ukraine support tracker that tells that is the best source of information of who supports Ukraine with how much money and how many weapons. And this guy was saying that Germany is on a completely wrong track, and it really needs to change. And this is the old industrial policy kicking back in again. And this will not, by the way, contribute to growth. Mm-hmm. If you can turn defense spending into an increase in productivity. That's not happening here. What it is, it's basically the old pork barrel, industrial spending. This is like another industrial program, old industry program, with a few crumbs left for new companies. And this is the thing in Germany, because of the way the banking sector operates. It's very difficult for startup companies in Germany to grow big. The banking system is geared towards subsidizing, or I'm saying subsidizing, towards supporting large companies, existing companies, but it's not really geared to support and take risks in the development of new companies. Mm. So the startup companies in Germany are small, and most of them either stay small or they leave Germany. That's basically the way it goes. And since most of the defense spending Germany wants to spend domestically rather than through imports, it is very clear that there is an inbuilt bias in favor of old or mid-tech technology at the expense of high technology. And these two things are deeply connected. So this defense thing, there are reports. Yes, there is a report that Rheinmetall takes over a factory from Volkswagen. And instead of producing cars, they produce tanks. But that's not what we need. And we see this in Ukraine. It's not like that tanks are. I mean, the decisive weapon at the moment in the war of Ukraine, at the battlefront, are drones that both sides are using, and different types of drones. And the development is incredibly fast. In fact, the development cycle of a new drone is faster than the purchasing cycle of the German army. So even if the German army ever decides to buy something like this, it will already be out of date by the time it gets delivered.
Yeah, and also this defense spending is, in a sense, somehow depends on what happens in Ukraine as well, because now it's somehow legitimized by the fact that there is a war at the borders of the European Union. So how do you see the war in Ukraine playing out in I don't want to ask you to predict, but what kind of trajectories do you see more realistically in the near future?
Yeah, I mean, I can't predict outcomes of war. I mean, I see what everyone else is seeing. I see that Russia is making progress. That the current balance of forces and also the current support we're giving to Ukraine would suggest that the advantage is on the Russian side at the moment. What I do know is that Europe have overestimated the effect of economic sanctions. The idea of sanctions was to cripple Russia's ability to wage war, and we have to state clearly that this objective failed. The other objective was for Ukraine to win, or at least to repel Russia. That objective failed. So it's not clear to me what the objective of Europe is now. And I don't think that the EU has an agreed objective. If I listen to Kaja Kallas, the High Representative for Foreign Policy, one gets the impression that the objective is regime change in Russia. She would probably ideally, it seems from her sort of, strong rhetoric, that she would favor that the EU and NATO would wage war against Russia directly. Others are significantly more cautious. Obviously, your own prime minister is significantly opposed to further action against Russia. So you have significant division in the EU about the right course of action. And what I'm also observing is a fall in military supplies. And I think we have to be sort of realistic about this. I mean, there's an awful lot of West Europeans who have, on their X accounts or social media accounts, they have the Ukrainian flag and they support Ukraine and with words. But to do what it takes for European countries to supply Ukraine with weaponry that would be sufficient for Ukraine to repel Russia would require an increase, not just of a few more weapons. It would doing 5 times, 10 times as much as we are doing. This is not something we can do through loans. This is something through, it would cost us 1% of GDP, something in that order. And it means that you either raise taxes, it means that you spend less money on welfare, whatever, could be different in different countries. I can absolutely assure you that Germany is not ready for that. Olaf Scholz said this. He said, if you asked us to cut welfare in order to support Ukraine, the support for Ukraine would collapse in Germany. So the only way for Germany to support Ukraine is for the government to make it look like it's for free. Obviously, we all know there is no such thing as free lunch in economics. It's not for free. A debt isn't free. It's future taxes. So it's a delusion, but they might just support that delusion. That can happen. In France, we have a zero fiscal leeway. In fact, France has to save money. So does Belgium. So do many other countries. They have significant fiscal constraints. The UK has a massive fiscal constraint where the government has to break promises about taxes in order to make ends meet. The EU is not ready financially to do what it pretends to do. So what happens now is that the EU is supporting Ukraine in words, and Zelensky never misses out on a European summit. He's always there, and they travel to him. But the financial support isn't there. The EU is not in a position to take up the slack or the vacuum that was created by Donald Trump when he seized the support for Ukraine. and Trump is not going to step back in again. Sometimes he makes statements about this, and sometimes he appears to be on the side of Zelensky. Then he's on the other side again. We've seen this going in two ways. We should not look at what Trump says, but we should look at the actions. And the actions of the United States has been to cut off the supplies. They are not supplying tomahawks to Ukraine, despite of everything that was sort of suggested at some point. So the Americans stay aside, and they support Ukrainian membership of the EU. It doesn't cost them anything, and Trump will always support European countries buying U.S. weapons. So to help Ukraine, but the U.S. is not actively engaged in the war effort beyond the minimal thing which they supply. They still supply intelligence support for all we know. So I see there are some seriously bad scenarios ahead where Putin could make further territorial gains.
Final question. I would like to talk a bit more about this, the kind of the future prospects of the European Union. So there are a lot of proposals on how to turn things around, from Draghi to other more right or more left-wing proposals on how to turn things around in the European Union. But what we see is also a problem of political gridlock that actually blocks us from implementing any kind of strategy. So we see it in, most of the elections bring us very razor-thin majorities. We see somehow political gridlock in France, in a sense. We see the same thing in Germany, in other countries as well. We see an ascendant so-called populist right, but there the proposals don't also seem to be very novel. So if we look at the economic proposals of AfD or Giorgia Meloni, it's the same old in a sense. So what's your take? What would be the kind of the way out of this gridlock? I'm asking because you mentioned our Prime Minister Viktor Orbán in a recent speech. He somehow said that by the end of the next budgetary cycle in the EU, so I guess by 2034, the European Union is going to fall apart. So this was his prediction, his bet that he made in public in front of a huge forum. So is he right, or what is the future scenario in this sense?
My scenario is, I never look at, I think, I've been sort of analyzing European politics pretty much all my adult life. And one of the lessons I've learned is not to listen to what people say, but to what people do. In fact, this is also a good way, as I just mentioned, to actually analyze Trump, because there's an awful lot of noise he generates, and you can easily get upset about this or hyperventilate about this. But it's actually just look at what he says. Look at like his tariffs, which is about fiscal revenue. It's not about anything else. On Europe, you described the state. We have gridlock. We have political gridlock. There is no party on the right or the left or the center that is solving the problem. Now, the Draghi report is something that somebody said. It's not something that somebody does. And therefore, it's irrelevant because it's not going to be acted upon. And the majorities do not appear. It's a prescription. And as we move further down the road, it will probably get out of date at some point. The idea that we generate 800 billion in annual investments in modern technologies is for the birds. It's not going to happen because we don't have a capital market that can support this, and the capital market, a real capital market that does heavy lifting. Not, when you speak to people in Brussels and I talk about a capital market, they mean more powers to Brussels. That's not what we mean. We mean a market that can generate, 800 billions of investments. That we mean pension funds, private pension funds, changes to pension systems. Such a capital market needs to be cemented by a European federal debt security. It needs to be cemented by political union. So ultimately, there's no way that goes around a political union, and we all probably agree it's not going to happen because the political situation for this is not right. So my central scenario is that Europe is declining, just as Germany will continue to decline. These two obviously go hand in hand. Europe is declining. It will lose more and more influence in the world, but it will stick together because it's going to be harder to unravel the EU than to just let it decline. We must not underestimate. There's an awful lot of laws of the EU, a lot of structures created by the EU, like the euro, very difficult to unravel. And I wouldn't know where to start to unravel the euro, because there's so many contractual agreements and flows, money stuck in payment systems of in other countries. To unravel that would be an absolute nightmare. So it's not what Orbán is suggesting is not a probable scenario. However, I have to make one sort of qualification to this. If you take extreme scenarios that the EU would solve its problems and that the EU would break up, if you ask me to bet between those extreme scenarios, I'd say the negative one is far more likely than the positive.
I have to ask just a quick final question, because we see this similar rhetoric that Orbán espouses, that the Central and Eastern Europeans, so the new member states, are somehow the future of the EU because we think differently, and this is not just Orbán, but a lot of other leaders in Poland, in Czech Republic and other countries as well. But on the other hand, they are economically so much integrated into the Western European and German supply lines and production lines. So what do you see? Will they keep also somehow being integrated here, or is there some kind of an alternative of divergence between the Eastern and the Western half of the European Union?
I would be careful about the new and old Europe. I remember Donald Rumsfeld was already talking about new and old Europe, and it never quite added up. You're absolutely right. We have integrated supply chains. My policy recommendation for the members, especially for the Central European countries, would be to make yourself less dependent on Germany. That's something that I think is quite strong. I wouldn't say to cut yourself off. That is not right. But Germany created a lot of toxic dependency. I mean, Germany is a very large country, and it cannot, it can't just do one thing. It can't just have one sector. So it needs to operate like big sectors and many sectors. And its mistake was to make itself dependent on the US for sales, on China for inputs, on Russia for gas. So it created multiple fairly toxic level of dependencies, and it didn't have plan B in place at the time when these dependencies were frayed. I would not recommend that anybody does the same with Germany, that you become dependent on Germany for your industry. So I would probably weigh this up against China, against other countries, and achieve a greater degree of diversification. And diversification is also what creates robustness. It also creates sort of not just resilience, and this is a word people might use, but it's also thriving under pressure. These are things that we might look for. And I would strongly recommend that this is the way to go, rather than sort of fostering these close relationships, because a lot of these industries that Eastern European companies are supplying into may no longer be there in the future, and one has to constantly rethink business models and not rely on one particular model.
Wolfgang Münchau, thank you so much for sharing your ideas. It was a very inspiring discussion for me. Thank you very much. I hope we could have you as a guest in the future as well.
Sheila, thank you very much for having me.
Ez volt az interjúm Wolfgang Münchauval, a Eurointelligence elemző intézet igazgatójával. Ez az adás az Unorthodox című interjúsorozat keretében készült, amelyben a világ legkülönbözőbb tájairól beszélgetek olyan emberekkel, akik segítenek megérteni a körülöttünk lévő világ rohamos átalakulását. Ha érdekelnek ezeknek a folyamatoknak a további aspektusai, akkor ajánlani tudom a köztes néven futó hírlevelemet is, amelyet a www.papszilárd.eu oldalon értek el. És persze, ne feledjétek, ha nem akartok lemaradni a Partizán legkülönfélébb adásairól, akkor iratkozzatok fel a csatornára itt a YouTube-on, kövessetek minket a különböző közösségi médiás felületeinken, és szálljatok be a támogatásunkba, hogy minél több és minél jobb minőségű adást tudjunk nektek készíteni. Munkatársaim nevében is köszönöm szépen, hogy velünk tartottatok, sziasztok!